The first snow came early that year. It didn't fall soft. It cut sideways, biting, like something personal. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Hills, carrying the smell of iron and cedar. And by dusk, the town of Larkspur Hollow was nothing but a gray blur of chimneys and horses, shifting their weight for warmth. And in that storm, a woman walked. Her name was Etta Vale, or what was left of it. Folks in town didn't use it much anymore. They called her the Widow Witch, though she'd never been married and never cast a spell in her life. The name stuck after the preacher's boy took sick a fever that burned out of nowhere and left his mother shrieking in the chapel. Etta had nursed him the week before, and when he died, tongues turned quick. They said her touch was cursed, that her eyes, gray and still, like the winter pond, carried death. By the time she was driven from her cabin, her hands were cracked, her breath fogged with hunger, and she had nowhere left to go but the barn on Dry Creek Road, half collapsed and owned by no one. She crawled through a broken plank, brushed away straw stiff with frost, and lay down in the corner where the air didn't move. The place smelled of old hay, mouse droppings, and the ghost of horses. Every creak of the rafters sounded like judgment. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, she whispered to herself, "Just till morning, Etta, just one more night." But morning didn't bring mercy, it brought boot steps. At first, faint a slow drag of spurs across frozen dirt. Then closer, then stopping right outside the barn door. A shadow moved under the gap. Then the door opened, wind howling in with it, and a man stood there tall, broad, his coat heavy with snow, his eyes sharp as a knife honed too long. Silas Wren, the richest man in 3 counties. Cattle baron, railroad investor, and widower. He looked at her, the woman crouched among his hay, like he was looking at something he'd dreamed once and tried to forget. "Cold night to be trespassing," he said, voice low, steady. Etta didn't speak. She pulled the old shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll leave," she managed, her voice rough from days without use. But Silas stepped forward, kicked the door shut, and set down the lantern. The yellow light spread over the barn, revealing her face, the bruises under her chin, the frost clinging to her lashes. He sighed, slow. "You got nowhere to go, do you?" She shook her head. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was wind rattling the boards. Then Silas set his gloves down on a beam and said quietly, "Then you stay right there. That's my bed now, for you." The words didn't sound like pity. They sounded like atonement. He turned, unbuckled his coat, and tossed it toward her. It landed heavy, smelling of smoke and leather. Etta stared at it, not moving. "Take it," he said without looking back. "You'll freeze before dawn." And then he walked out into the storm. Etta didn't know it yet, but that single night, the night she slept, wrapped in the coat of the richest man in Larkspur Hollow, would set off a chain of reckonings. By the week's end, someone would hang, someone would confess, and something buried deep in that frozen town would finally crawl into the light. By sunrise, the storm had passed, but Larkspur Hollow had already begun to whisper. A stable boy named Tom saw Etta leave Silas Wren's barn just before dawn, wrapped in his black duster coat. He told one person who told 3 more, and by noon, the story had already changed shape. She bewitched him. He's keeping her. The widow witch found herself a rich man's bed. That was how the town worked. Truth never made it past breakfast. Etta didn't look back when she crossed the frozen meadow, coat dragging behind her like a shadow that didn't belong. She'd planned to return it quietly by nightfall, but now every door she passed seemed to close faster than the last. At the general store, Mrs. Calloway stopped sweeping her porch. At the post office, the clerk turned his head. Even the blacksmith spat on the ground as she walked by. By the time she reached the river, Etta knew she couldn't go back to her old cabin. Someone had ransacked it, the door hanging open, the few things she'd owned scattered in the snow. Her fingers brushed the burnt edge of a photo lying in the drift, her mother's face half gone to ash. She crouched there, silent, until she heard a voice behind her. "Don't pick at the ashes," Silas said softly. "They bite." She turned. He was standing by his horse, rein slack in one hand, watching her like a man studying a wound. "You followed me?" she asked. "I came to give you breakfast." He tossed her a wrapped parcel still warm. Bread, eggs, a slice of bacon. She stared at it, then at him. "You think that fixes it?" "No," he said, simply. "But it starts it." He dismounted and crouched by the river, scooping up a handful of snow to wash his hands. His movements were steady, almost weary. "Town's been waiting years for a reason to hate you," he said. "Don't give them one." Etta's laugh came out cracked. "They don't need reasons, just targets." Silas met her eyes. For a long moment, neither looked away. Then he said, "You ever wonder why they're scared of you? I don't care." "You should," he murmured. "Fear's easier to burn than guilt." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer. He just took off his gloves and rolled up his sleeves. On the inside of his wrist was a faint scar, a half-circle brand, like a horseshoe that had healed wrong. "I know what it's like to wear a mark that don't wash off," he said. "People pretend not to see it, but they always do." Etta looked down at her hands, the skin red, raw, still carrying. The rope burns from the night the men dragged her from her cabin. The mark of shame. "Why'd you help me?" she asked quietly. "You could have turned me out." Silas rose, brushing snow from his trousers. "Because once," he said, "someone didn't help me, and I've been paying for it ever since." He turned his horse toward the trail, voice low but sharp. "Don't stay near the river tonight. The men who started those rumors, they ride with lanterns now." Then he was gone, just the sound of hooves fading into the cold. That evening, when the first lantern lights appeared on the ridge, Etta hid in the old mill by the frozen stream. She watched the men ride past 6 of them, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles slung low. And leading them was Marshal Avery, the same man who'd once sworn to protect her mother. The same man who'd signed the order to burn her cabin. When the riders left, one lantern fell shattering against the rocks. The flame hissed out in the snow, but something glowed faintly beneath it. A brand iron, half buried, its tip still warm. Etta picked it up with trembling fingers. "If they mean to burn me," she whispered, "I'll burn first." The brand still held a faint heat, even in the cold. Etta wrapped it in a scrap of cloth and pressed it against her chest like a secret she didn't ask for. The iron was old, the shape of a crooked W, burned unevenly. She'd seen that mark before, on cattle that once grazed the Wren Ranch long before Silas became rich enough to forget the hills that raised him. She didn't sleep that night. Every gust of wind against the mill boards sounded like a horse snort, every creak like boot leather shifting in the dark. By morning, she made up her mind to return the coat and the brand both and be done with him. The Wren Ranch was a kingdom of fences and silence. The main house sat high on the rise, white paint flaked by wind, its porch lined with empty rocking chairs. Etta walked past the frozen troughs, her breath cutting short with each step. When she reached the barn, she found Silas inside, shirt sleeves rolled, hands deep in a bucket of oats, feeding a gray stallion with a patience that looked older than he was. "You don't belong here," he said without turning. "Neither do you," she replied, holding up the brand. "This was left for me last night." That made him turn. His eyes caught the iron, and something in his face shifted. A shadow crossed it, slow and heavy, like an old grief remembered too fast. "Where'd you find that?" "By the creek, dropped by your marshal and his boys." Silas's jaw tightened. "That mark shouldn't exist anymore." "Then tell me why it does." He took the brand from her carefully, holding it by the handle. The tip was black, charred. He looked at it for a long while before speaking. "That was my father's brand," he said finally. "He used it on thieves. Men, women, didn't matter. If someone stole a loaf of bread or a horse, he burned them with it. Said shame kept the world in line. And you kept it? She asked quietly. He nodded once. To remind me what mercy costs. Etta frowned. You talk like it's a debt. It is. Silas set the iron down on a bale of hay. His hands were shaking now, though his voice stayed steady. When I was 16, he said, we caught a girl stealing grain. My father said she'd done it before, and this time he'd make sure she remembered. I was supposed to hold her still while he branded her. Etta's stomach turned. Did you? He nodded, slow. I held her wrists. I smelled her hair burn. And she screamed my name till her throat bled. Silas turned away, face buried in shadow. She died that winter. Fever. I built this ranch with her voice still in my head. Every nail in these walls is paid. For with that sound, the barn went silent again. Even the horses stilled. Etta stepped closer. So when you found me, he looked up. I saw her. The confession hung between them like smoke. Etta wanted to hate him. She wanted to throw the brand in his face, to call him what the town had called her. But what she saw in his eyes wasn't pride or pity. It was the quiet ruin of a man who'd lived too long inside his own guilt. You can't undo what's burned, she said softly. No, he said. But maybe I can choose what gets burned next. He picked up the brand and walked toward the hearth. Without a word, he dropped it into the fire. The iron hissed, sparked, and then glowed red. Silas turned to her. You want to end this curse, Etta Vale? She met his gaze, steady. I want to stop running from it. He nodded once. Then tomorrow, we ride to town. That night, smoke rose from the Wren Ranch, not from the chimney, but from the barn itself. And when the townfolk woke to the smell of iron and ash, they found the old cattle brand buried deep in the snow, twisted beyond use. But they also found something else. On the church door, carved with a blade, were the words, Mercy belongs to no man's hand. By noon the next day, the whole of Larkspur Hollow stood awake with gossip. Someone had seen smoke rising from the Wren Ranch. Someone else swore they'd heard screams carried downwind. But when Marshal Avery rode out to check on the disturbance, he found nothing but a circle of blackened snow and 2 sets of tracks headed straight for town. By the time Etta and Silas appeared on the main road, every porch was filled. Men leaning on posts, women clutching shawls, children pulled back by nervous hands. Even the church bell stopped swinging. Etta rode bareback behind Silas, wearing the same black coat he'd once given her, though this time it looked like armor. She held her chin high, even as whispers snapped around her like whipcord. That's her. He brought the witch to town himself. Must have turned him too. Silas reined in his horse outside the saloon. The sign creaked in the wind. The Hollow's Rest. Every man inside had once bought whiskey with Wren's money, and now they stared from the windows, waiting to see which side he'd stand on. Etta dismounted slowly, boots crunching in the snow. She didn't wait for Silas to speak. Marshal Avery, she called. Her voice carried across the square, clear as a bell strike. You were out by the creek last night. Avery stepped forward, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His face was red from the cold or from guilt. You accusing me of something, girl? Etta smiled, but it wasn't kindness. Only asking what you dropped. He frowned. You talking about that brand? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas spoke now, low but steady. That brand was outlawed years ago, my quote. Father's mark. You used it on her. The marshal's jaw clenched. She's a danger to this town. She spread sickness and lies. And what sickness did my father's victims spread? Silas shot back. Hunger? Poverty? The tension snapped like a drawn rope. People shifted, uneasy. Etta took a step closer to Avery. You burned my mother's house. You left her to freeze. Avery's hand twitched toward his gun, but he didn't draw. You think anyone here will believe a witch over me? And that's when it happened. That small crack of defiance that splits a town clean in two. From the edge of the crowd, a child's voice rang out. She helped me when I was sick. Heads turned. It was little Clara Whitcomb, no more than 8, clutching her mother's skirt. She made me tea when nobody else would. You said I'd die, but I didn't. The mother tried to hush her, but it was too late. The silence that followed wasn't loyalty. It was doubt. And doubt, once it shows its face, can't be buried again. Etta felt her breath hitch. For the first time, she saw something flicker in the townsfolk's eyes that wasn't hate, it was uncertainty. Silas stepped beside her. "You hear that, Marshal? That's your town talking!" Avery sneered. "This town needs order, not mercy." "Then maybe it's time you stopped pretending they're the same thing," Silas said. Avery moved fast, but not fast enough. The moment his gun cleared leather, Silas's hand was already on his own. The two reports echoed like thunder across the square. Avery's hat spun into the snow. His shot went wide, buried itself in the saloon wall. Silas's bullet struck the ground an inch from the marshal's boot. "Leave," Silas said softly, eyes flat as cold steel. "Before I decide to aim higher." Avery stared at him, then at the crowd, now silent and watching. For the first time, no one moved to back him. Even his deputy stayed still. He spat in the snow and turned away. As his horse's hooves faded down the street, no one followed. Etta exhaled, her hands trembling. "You didn't have to do that." Silas holstered his gun. "Didn't do it for you," he said. "Did it for what's left of this place." That night, the wind shifted again. The smell of the burned brand still lingered in the valley, but so did something new, something softer. When dawn came, someone had laid wildflowers at Etta's old cabin door, and on the church wall, the carving had been scrubbed clean except for the last 3 words, "Left untouched." No man's hand. The thaw came early that year, sudden, violent, like the earth itself was tired of being quiet. Snowmelt turned the ground to mud, and the Bitterroot River swelled so fast it tore whole trees from their roots. By the 3rd day, the riverbank behind the church began to crumble, and with it, the last fragile calm of Larkspur Hollow. The townsfolk gathered again, this time not for gossip, but judgment. Marshal Avery hadn't left town after all. He'd holed up with his men in the blacksmith's barn, drinking, nursing the wound to his pride. Rumors came fast that he'd sent word to the circuit judge in Missoula, that he'd sworn to bring justice to the Hollow before spring. And justice, in Avery's mouth, meant blood. At sunset, Silas found Etta by the river. She was washing soot from her hands, watching the current carry it away. "You should have run by now," he said. "I'm done running." He crouched beside her, voice low. "They mean to try you proper or not. Avery's got half the town believing you cursed their crops." She looked up, face calm, almost tired. "Then let them try me. Let them see what a curse looks like when it bleeds." Silas gritted his teeth. "You think dying's gonna change them?" "No," she whispered. "But maybe it'll shame them." He slammed his hand into the mud. "You talk like shame's stronger than fear. It ain't. Then why are you still here?" That stopped him cold. When the riders came that night, torches high, Etta didn't hide. She walked out to meet them at the river, wrapped once again in Silas's coat. The crowd followed, drawn like moths' old faces, new faces, men who'd once bought her herbs and now spat her name. Avery dismounted, the firelight crawling across his face. "Etta Vale," he called. "By the authority of there's no judge here," Silas interrupted. He stepped forward, coat open, gun on his hip. "Only you, Avery. And you ain't authority. You're just afraid." Avery smirked. "Afraid of what? Some dirt witch and a guilty man?" Silas's hand twitched near his revolver, but Etta caught his arm. "No more fire," she said softly. Avery laughed. "You should have thought of that before you set the town against me. But since you want mercy, So bad we'll give you a trial by it. He pointed toward the river, black, swollen, furious. If you're innocent, God'll spare you. The crowd murmured, some turning away, others leaning in. Silas stepped between them. You throw her in that river, and you'll have to throw me too. Avery grinned. So be it. 2 men grabbed Silas before he could draw. Another took Etta by the arms. She didn't fight. Her eyes stayed fixed on Silas, and for a heartbeat, there was something almost peaceful in them, like she'd been waiting for this end all along. Avery raised his torch. Let the river decide. And then, without ceremony, they were thrown in. The shock of it hit like knives. The current spun them under, pulling hard, dragging at their clothes. Etta's lungs burned. Her fingers clawed for anything solid. She caught Silas's sleeve once, then lost it in the dark. The roar of the water swallowed everything, and then hands. Rough, strong, pulling, light above her. Silas hauled her up onto the bank, both of them choking, coughing out river water. The crowd had gone silent. Not one dared step closer. Etta lay gasping, her hair plastered to her face. The torchlight caught the skin of her neck pale and unmarked. Avery stared. She should be dead. She's not, Silas rasped. Guess Mercy had other plans. No one laughed this time. The next morning, the river had dropped a little. The mud still smelled of smoke and fear. Etta stood on the bank alone, clutching something small, a river stone smooth as bone, marked faintly by the iron she once carried. She set it down in the water and watched it sink. If the river can forgive, she whispered, so can I. Behind her, a single rider approached Silas, pale, weak, but alive. He looked at her, voice breaking. You think it's over? Etta shook her head. Not yet, but now they'll remember. Weeks later, when the thaw was done and the first grass came up green, children playing by the river found that same stone again, carved now with a single word, endure. And near the edge of town, on Silas Wren's ranch, a new garden grew wild, small, stubborn, just like the woman who planted it. Spring came slow that year. The wind softened first, then the ground gave way, and what the fire hadn't destroyed began to bloom again. Wildflowers in the pasture, moss over the old millstones, and something quieter, steadier in the hearts of the people. Etta Vale didn't leave Larkspur Hollow. She stayed on the edge of Silas Wren's land, where the river bent like an old scar through the meadow. The barn that had once been her shelter was rebuilt not for cattle this time, but for seed, soil, and silence. Every morning, she worked with her hands in the dirt. No spells, no charms, just the kind of patience only grief can teach. And, slowly, things grew. Silas came most days, though he never said why. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he just stood watching from his horse. The river's edge had taken much from both of them, yet neither seemed eager to forget it. One afternoon, as the sun folded behind the ridges, he came carrying a small crate. Inside, wrapped in burlap, was something gray and metallic, the old brand, the same one they'd thrown into the fire. It was warped now, blackened, twisted beyond recognition. Etta stared at it, silent. They dug it up when they cleared the barn, Silas said. Couldn't bring myself to toss it. She brushed the ash away from the handle. You still keeping your ghosts then? Maybe, he said. Or maybe I thought you'd want to decide what happens to this one. Etta took the brand, turned it in her hands, and for a long moment said nothing. Then she set it in the earth beside the riverbank and began to cover it with soil, one handful at a time. When she finished, she stood back. Let it stay there, she said. Let the ground carry it, not us. Silas nodded. You believe it's buried for good? Etta smiled faintly. Nothing that's burned ever really goes away. But sometimes that's not a curse. Sometimes it's just memory. Weeks turned to months. The whispers in town faded, not because people forgot, but because new life demanded other talk. The widow witch became the river woman, the one who healed wounds, nursed the sick calves, and brought food to the widows of the men who once hunted her. The children who used to hide now waved when she passed. Even the church doors stayed open again. Marshall Avery left the Hollow that summer. Some said he joined a railroad company out east. Others said he drowned on the trail. No one marked his grave. That's reportin'. You 17. That's trains. But the scar he'd left on the town, the fear, the silence, it healed slower than any wound. Silas tried not to look at the past, but sometimes at night, he'd walk down to the river and see her shadow working by lantern light, mending tools, or tending her garden. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for punishment. He felt forgiven. Late one evening, as thunder rumbled far off in the hills, Etta sat outside the barn with a candle and a scrap of paper. She wrote slowly, carefully. For whoever finds this ground, let mercy root deeper than judgment. She weighed the paper down with a small stone, the same one the river had returned. Its single carved word was still visible beneath the soot. Endure. The next morning, she was gone. No one saw her leave. Some said she'd gone west toward the frontier, where her name meant nothing. Others swore they saw her riding at dawn, hair unbound, following the river's bend until she disappeared into mist. Silas never spoke of it. He just kept the barn standing, the garden tended, and every spring, when the first green shoots broke through, he'd whisper, "You endured." Years later, travelers passing through Larkspur Hollow would stop to rest by the river. They'd see the flowers growing wild along the bank, yellow, red, and pale blue, and ask who planted them. The locals would shrug. "Wasn't no one living," they'd say. "Just the woman who slept in a barn one winter, and the man who gave her his bed." And at night, when the wind carried the scent of cedar through the valley, some swore they could hear her voice soft, steady, half prayer, half truth. No shame lasts forever, only the mercy you plant after. Some legends end in fire, others in blood. But the ones worth remembering, they end in forgiveness, whispered in the dark. So if you ever find yourself near the Bitterroot River and see the garden that blooms there, look close. Beneath the soil lies an old iron brand, rusted, forgotten, but never gone. Because mercy, once buried, still breathes. If this story touched your heart, don't just pass it by. Subscribe for more untold Wild West legends of mercy, defiance, and quiet survival.